Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGeek webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight of various domains. The topic of today's session is Agile Testing in a mobile environment. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Julian Harty, speaker at World Conference Next Generation Testing Bangalore. Julian's been actively involved in testing and test automation for mobile apps since 2006. He develops Android apps, works on testing and test automation for web and mobile apps, and shares much of his material freely. He's worked for Google for 4 years and eBay for 18 months in global roles. Over the years, he has also participated in hundreds of workshops and conferences globally. So without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speaker. Over to you, Mr. Julian.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to chat a little bit about Agile to set the scene, and then a bit about the testing using mobile devices and a specific experience report of mine, which will hopefully add color to the rest of the presentation. Agile then includes the concept of time-boxed iterations. An iteration is a period, a fixed period, where we decide what work we'll be doing for that period. At the end of it, we measure how we've done. Typically, a time-boxed iteration is between 1 week and 4 weeks for projects, and many companies use an iteration of around 2 weeks. One of the key challenges with Agile is to get feedback. We realize that whatever we're developing isn't perfect, isn't necessarily complete, and so we need the feedback to help us adapt what we're doing and improve our work. The feedback is in two main forms. There's technology-facing feedback, which provides information about the technical aspects of the project and the software we're writing. And then we have the business-facing feedback, which is focusing on the business needs of the project. For instance, does a new application satisfy the users? Does it allow us to increase the revenue? The feedback needs to be continuous, and continuous is one of the aspects of working with Agile projects. We have the concept of continuous integration, which is where we integrate work from developers and other people who create work together quickly and often, rather than waiting to combine it at the end of a project. We have continuous builds, which is when we integrate the software, we make sure we can build it correctly and the build doesn't fail. This provides very early feedback in case perhaps someone's forgotten to add a new file into the source control system. We need continuous testing to test the software that's being built and to get some sort of feedback on, does it build correctly, does it do what we expect it to do, and all this feedback needs to be shared with everyone involved in the project, ranging from the business people through to the developers, the testers, the project leaders, the UX people, etc., etc. With Agile, we don't necessarily need to just test our software. We can use other forms of feedback and integrate that into the testing to help inform us about the quality of the software and whether we're building the right software. There are concepts such as mobile analytics, which is where we add additional software into our mobile applications, and that reports additional information as the software is being used by the users, and this data is then aggregated or combined, and we can look at the aggregated data, and that helps us to understand how the software is behaving. Customer service feedback is another form of input we can use to augment our understanding of the project, and there's plenty of other system data we can collect to help us understand whether our Agile project is doing the right thing and on track. In terms of testing then, automation is pivotal for effective testing. We can't really do Agile very well without test automation, and we use automation in context. So the automation, I consider its use for continuous aspects of the project. A few minutes ago I mentioned about continuous integration, continuous builds, continuous testing, and continuous feedback. Where practical, we try to automate these aspects of the testing. And this would range from unit testing of the small pieces of code, the individual classes and methods being written by the development teams, through to testing the complete application. Test automation is a continuum, and I'm not quite sure how this explains well to you, but the concept I'm using is sometimes we're looking at the synchronization between the automated tests and the software that's being tested. Sometimes we write the automated tests in advance of writing the rest of the software. This is a concept commonly known as test-driven development, and the test helps shape and design the design of the code and the implementation of the code. So the tests are there first, we write them first, and then we write the code that supports the tests to satisfy the tests. And when that code has been written, the tests pass, and the tests don't pass beforehand. The tests may be written in sync at the same time as the code that's being written. Here the focus would be to write small automated unit tests that live alongside the main code base of the application. Quite often, however, projects write the automated tests afterwards, after they've written the application code, and this might be minutes later, hours later, days later, or sometimes even months or years later. In this case, it's counterproductive to try and write the unit tests. So instead we start with testing the functionality, which is typically testing through an API if it's available in the application, or testing through the user interface. I mentioned that automation is in context, because ultimately our software is going to be used by human beings, by real people, and automation can't inform us about all aspects of the software that we want to test. So we need some form of testing by real people, and I call this interactive testing rather than manual testing, because interactive testing implies that humans are interacting with the software. Manual testing is quite often used in the industry to apply low-grade work, and low-grade testing is not useful for mobile applications or for agile applications, or in fact for anything really. I spoke recently at a conference in Vietnam, and the talk was on human aspects of testing mobile applications, and we'll be sharing a link at the end of the webinar which you can look at for more information about that talk. In terms of the interactive testing then, we want to focus on things like dynamic movements. Now this could be movement of the mobile phone, rotating it from landscape to portrait mode. It could be activating the accelerometers, which detect when the phone is being moved. It could be testing of switching between mobile networks, so switching from a 3G network to a Wi-Fi network. Perhaps as we're walking into an office building, the phone would automatically switch the connections, and we need to make sure the application still behaves well in those conditions. Or perhaps we're going into an area where there's no signal connectivity, and the application again needs to cope well in these conditions. Even if it needs the network, it should provide a sensible message that helps the user to understand what the problem is and how it can be resolved. And we want to focus on the human experiences of using the application. So this would include things like the usability of the mobile application. When we test a mobile application, it's not enough just to test on a single emulator or on a single physical device. There's too many differences that's caused by the choice of devices to allow us to take that risk. So we need to be able to test on multiple devices. The choice of which device to use depends on the platform that we're working with. So for the iOS operating system, which is used on iPads and iPhones, we need to test on the different scales of the screen size. We need to test the different versions of the platform. So the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 5 have different form factors. They have different screen resolutions. We want to test that. We want to focus our testing on the impact of key differences with the devices. So this could be things like the locales. If we're testing in Gujarati, we're going to get a different user interface than if we test in German. And we want to test these differences on the different devices. For Android devices, there are literally thousands of them, and the form factors vary much more than the iPhones. So we'd want to test on a range of different screen sizes ranging from the small screen sizes to the extra high density screen sizes. For Android, it's key to test on what are known as the reference devices. These are the devices that Google has put their stamp on. The most recent one is the Nexus 4, the Nexus 7 devices. Before that, it was things like the Nexus S and going right back to the original G1 phone. These are the ones that we need to make sure our software always works on because it's closest to the ideal of the original intention of Android. Then we also want to test on popular devices, and Samsung is the world's largest manufacturer now, particularly of Android devices, so we probably want to test on some Samsung devices too. I'm going to move on to my experience report, which was based on testing a global application that's used in probably 50 plus countries around the world, and it delivers hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. For the mobile platforms, they have a series of different applications for the iOS platform, for the Android, for mobile web, and for HTML5. They also support BlackBerry devices, and that's still particularly popular in countries such as Nigeria, which is one of the world's largest markets for the BlackBerry devices. And we need to make sure that we cover those as well as the more modern smartphones. In our case, we had an engineering team in another country, in fact in another continent, who developed the server applications, and the mobile applications were developed in England. And we needed to make sure that when we tested the integration with the back-end services as well as the applications that we were developing. So we needed to test the APIs provided by the servers as well as the client software we were working with. Most of the testing was done by human beings, and typically by a small team for each individual platform. So there's a separate testing team for iOS, a separate testing team for Android, and similarly a separate testing team for web and HTML5. Those two are sufficiently similar that the same team tested both outputs, both forms of the application. We also looked at using test automation technologies. The test automation was being developed slightly after the main code base was being developed for the applications, and it meant that the test automation tended to be for the functionality and at the application level. And we tried a variety of open source and commercial test automation frameworks. These included Calabash, which is a high-level cross-platform test automation tool, using a language called Cucumber. These are all very strange names, but some of you will be familiar with these. So Cucumber is a scripting language which is intended to be readable by people. So it uses verbs such as given something, when something happens, then I expect the following to be visible, I expect the following to happen. Zucchini was another test automation platform focusing on the iOS platform, very similar to Calabash in terms of the scripting language, but a slightly different implementation. We use Monkey Runner, which is test automation from Google. They've released it a couple of years ago, and it allowed the scripts to be written in a programming language called Python, so slightly more hands-on, but at a different level, a simpler level than writing the application code. And it allows us to put user inputs through clicks and typing into text boxes and check the results, particularly using images to match. If matching images is problematic, it tends to have a very high error rate. In our case, we wanted to make sure that the screens were pixel perfect in some cases and detect any movement in the user interface because it affected the user experience and the feedback we got from users. We also use MonkeyTalk. MonkeyTalk is developed by a commercial company, but they've released all the software as open source and it's free for anyone to use. And it uses a table-driven approach, so it's a bit like working with Excel, to write the automated test cases, and it takes care of many of the details of interacting with the mobile application. In the end, however, we found that MonkeyTalk wasn't that suitable for us, partly because we found that as the operating systems updated, for instance to iOS 6, MonkeyTalk didn't support iOS 6 for several months, and we just had so many problems trying to keep up with it that we eventually abandoned it. For the mobile website, we use Selenium WebDriver, which is a project that many of you will be familiar with. It's used for desktop test automation and also has support for Android and iOS for test automation, so we use that. And we had a proprietary test automation framework where we wrote a little bit of extra code that lived inside the applications, the mobile applications, purely for testing, that allowed us to get extra information from the application and provide extra inputs to augment the testing we wanted to do. Examples of where this can be particularly useful is things like testing the GPS and geolocation, where we could put our own coordinates in rather than relying on other inputs to simulate those values. The project had a 2-week sprint. The engineering teams, the people writing the applications, were also specific to a platform. And as I've already mentioned, the testers were responsible for the specific technology they were testing. So the testers were part of the development team and took part in the stand-ups, which are a daily brief meeting, normally in the morning, where they discuss what they were working on and a brief summary of any problems they might have. And the testers had to provide feedback on a daily basis. And the project used a continuous build, which had limited coverage of automated tests, which is another reason why we needed a lot of the interactive, the human testing. In terms of where was the time spent by the testers on this project, we found that the time was spent in 3 main areas. Testing applications before release. Now, release of a mobile application is different from releasing a web application, particularly where you're dealing with app stores, such as the Apple App Store or the Google Play App Store. When an application needs to be released, you don't give it directly to your users. Instead, it's deployed to an app store. The App Store then at a later time releases that software and makes it available. In some cases, that time might be an hour or so. In other cases, it can be several weeks, particularly where we're dealing with the iOS platform. And we need to take into account this time delay of the app stores when trying to make releases of application, particularly if we want to synchronize releases between the different platforms. So for iOS, we might have to deploy the application a week earlier than for Android. So we'd focus our testing to make sure we tested the iOS application first, and then follow with testing the Android application if we needed to make that choice. Furthermore, when you're releasing to an app store, they have their own quality criteria, and we had to make sure the quality criteria were met before the software was released to the app store. Otherwise, we risk having the application rejected by the app stores, and this then caused a major knock-on effect for the project. The second area where time was consumed was testing bugs and bug fixes. Typically, this testing was done by hand. The project also wrote test automation for some of the bug fixes, but most of the testing was done by hand. And again, we had to test it on multiple devices. And we had drawers full of mobile phones of different models and different platforms available to help us do this testing. And the final area that time was consumed was improving the testing process. Part of Agile is getting feedback to improve the quality of the work we do. And during each iteration, we would experiment with a new way of testing and see how we progress with that testing, whether it's able to find problems faster, more effectively, and with less overhead. In terms of Agile projects, then I'm going to refer you to a website. Again, we'll provide the link at the end, but the website is donottestme.wordpress.com, and it's a little article called How I Test in a Sprint, and it has 5 focal questions. And I think these questions apply generally to Agile projects and also make sense for the mobile projects. So we need to test the process. Are we doing things that make sense? Don't just assume that because someone's told us to do 3 days of regression testing, it's the right testing to do. We need to test the business value and the acceptance criteria. We're building the right thing, the right application. We need to test the delivery. Are we building the software in the right order? And this is in terms of adding features, adding support for new capabilities, and it's an incremental and iterative approach. We need to test the technology and make sure we're using the right tools and infrastructure for the project. And finally then, we need to do the testing and measurement. So we're measuring the project correctly, and we're interpreting the results correctly, and finally, do we act on the results accordingly? So that's the end of my main session. What I suggest now is we hand over to a Q&A session, and I've left plenty of time for questions from you, because I'm sure you've got plenty of good questions for me to try and answer. Can the moderator take over, please, for the Q&A session?
Julian, I've started assigning you questions. Are you able to see them? Able to see the questions, Julian?
Yes, please do show me the questions. I can't see them at the moment.
I've started assigning you the questions. They must be appearing in your questions pane now.
Yeah, okay, now I see that. Yes, good. Okay, I've got a stack of questions here. So let me start. I'll just have a quick skim through the questions and I'll pick the first one to answer. So the first question is asked by someone called R. Siva, and the question is, what is meant by agile testing in a mobile environment? For me, this means that the development team are creating a mobile application. Their focus is delivering software that will run on mobile phones, and they're using an agile development practice to write that software. So the testing needs to fit within the context of the development teams writing a mobile application where they're using an agile development practice, and the testing needs to finish in the same time box as the development. So if the developers are using a 2-week cycle, a 2-week iteration, then we need to make sure that our testing fits within the same 2-week iteration. If not, what happens is that we don't know if the software is finished and the new piece of functionality is complete until the next iteration, and that means we're then left trying to play catch-up with fixing any problems that we find from the testing. So it means inherently the testing needs to be quick and provide the feedback within a short period. I'm going to pick, I've got lots of questions, which is excellent, but it means I'm going to have to filter and pick a couple of the questions in turn. So do we have any testing tool for Windows mobile applications is the next question. And this, forgive me, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce the name correctly, is Raja Lakshmi Mathialagan's question. Microsoft with Windows 7 and Windows 8 do provide test automation tools for their platform, and there's test automation for Silverlight as well as for the mobile applications generally. What I do is recommend that you look at the Microsoft mobile development sites for details of these projects and look at their test automation frameworks. I don't do much work personally with Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 8's test automation, so I can't give you specific examples from my background. But I do know the tests exist, and I met the test lead for Windows Phone 8 fairly recently and had a good conversation with them about test automation. The next question I have is from Raja Jeevan Kumar, and I'm sorry I can't see the rest of your name. It's Maduri. Sorry, the screen's not very wide. So Raja Jeevan Kumar Maduri's question, which is, what according to your experience has been an OS independent and device independent test automation tool available in the market today? I'm going to assume this question is related to mobile test automation. And for mobile test automation, we don't have a tool that's independent of the operating system or the device. We simply haven't reached that level of sophistication yet. The platforms are too different for us to have a single tool. The closest we get to operating system independent and device independent test automation is where the test automation scripts are written in a high-level language, such as in Cucumber. So tools such as Calabash allow you to write a single set of tests that you can run across your iOS and Android devices, in theory, unchanged. And I say in theory because quite often the application we write actually has differences. We choose to make differences to the applications to make it more of an iPhone application or more of an Android application. So in practice, we very seldom have a single application that's available across the different mobile platforms. That changes slightly with the mobile web, and if we're dealing with HTML5 and similar mobile web applications, then the best choice we have at the moment is Selenium WebDriver for the test automation, and that works pretty well for iOS and for Android, but it doesn't cover some of the other platforms such as Windows Phone or the new BlackBerry devices. I've got a similar question here, which is by Reshu Agarwal, and the question is, what's the best way to test a single application across mobile platforms? This again would depend on whether it's a web application or what I call a native application, which is where we're developing it specifically for the different platforms. So the best way to test a single application depends on the teams that we're working with. In some companies, they say we have a single test team that tests all the mobile platforms because the key difference is mobile compared to, say, web or desktop applications. And for those teams, they'll be testing the functionality across the different mobile platforms while trying to take into account the differences in characteristics of a mobile platforms. And for those of you who've used different mobile smartphones, such as iPhones and Android, and a BlackBerry and a Windows Phone, you'll realize that they behave very differently. They look different, they work different, and an application has to be tailored to the individual platform for it to work effectively and to keep the users happy. Users typically don't want to see an iPhone application running on an Android phone. They want to see an Android application running on an Android phone, and they want to see an iPhone application on an iPhone. So for testing that, we need to make sure we're still testing the specifics of the mobile platforms. Sometimes we say that we actually want specific separate testing teams for each platform because we want to be so well integrated with the platforms and make sure that our application is the best it can be, say, for iPhone in particular. The next question is from Akal Sudhir, and the question is, are Cucumber Calabash unit testing tools? And they're not. So Cucumber is deliberately a high-level testing framework, and it's known as BDD, so it's behavior-driven testing. So we describe the behaviors we want, and in the tests that we write, we don't focus on how the behavior is implemented. So it would say something like, as a registered user, when I log in, then I expect to see my home page and welcome Julian. The tests don't say where to look for this information or how to navigate the user interface to check which text box to read to get the values out. And they certainly don't go down to the unit testing level. These are intended to be high-level, human-readable, and the implementation details are hidden away in the test automation framework. In comparison, unit testing is focusing on the technology that we're working with, the code that we're writing, and we typically write our unit testing code in the same programming language we're writing the application in. So for Android, we'd be writing them as JUnit test cases, which goes alongside the Java that's used to write the application. For iOS, we'd be using something like OCUnit, which is using Objective-C, which is testing the Objective-C code that's used to create the application. The next question I have is from Swati Bajaj, and the question is, which are the main areas to be focused while testing a mobile application, especially Android? For Android, the big challenge is dealing with the vast differences of physical devices, screen sizes, capabilities, sensors. There are so many thousands of different devices. So the first thing I would do is probably test on the reference devices. And these, I mentioned earlier, start with the G1 phone, which is the original phone, the first Android device ever released. And then what's known as the G2 or Google Ion device. And I would keep testing on those devices up to, say, the Nexus 4, perhaps the Nexus 7 tablet, or even the Nexus 10 tablet. And then I would test on a mix of other devices. I would test on the very popular devices, such as the Samsung ones. And I would also use some of my, I'll call them problematic phones. And I won't name any specific ones. But I have a couple of phones where I know that if the application is going to fail, it's going to fail on these devices. They tend to be the cheap, low-end devices where they're built down to a cost by the manufacturer rather than fancy ones that they advertise across all the billboards. So this is not the Galaxy 3 or the Galaxy 4. This is the cheap phone that someone buys when they don't really know what they're buying. They just want to buy a phone. And it happens to be an Android phone. And it will typically cost, these days, probably about $50 for those devices. So I'll test on those devices. The other things I would be testing are things like localization. The way that Android applications are written, all the screen UI and all the localization tends to be implemented in XML files and uses a hierarchy where all the application code and all these resource files, as they're known, are built into a single binary application that's deployed to the Android device through the App Store. At runtime, the Android device then works out which locale to display, so which text to display on the screen, and perhaps how the screen looks based on the physical device. So I'd want to make sure I tested those aspects on an Android device. The good news is I have more than 100 questions. But that means I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions in this session. So I'm going to read through here and look for some more questions to pick on. Okay, so the next question is from Mahesh D. And the question is, as you said, we need to first deploy the application on the App Store. Is it necessary all the time with different versions of the same application? And by this, I understand the question to say, do we need to release the application every time to the App Store? And we do. We don't have a direct relationship with the users, particularly for the Apple devices. For Apple, we really have to deploy through the App Store. And every time we make a change, and sometimes the change isn't even to the application, it's simply to the description of the application, that goes through the approval process on the App Store. Android, it's more flexible in terms of deploying to the App Store, but we still will typically deploy our application to the App Store for the end users. The subtle difference would be, from a testing perspective, it's fairly easy to deploy a debug version of the application directly to people's phones. For instance, we can send in an email or make the binary file available on a website, and someone with an Android phone can simply go and download and use that application, provided they've changed one of the settings on the phone to allow applications to come from other sources as well as from the App Store. So yes, we always need to first deploy the application on the App Store when it's going to the end users. If it's just being tested internally, and typically we'll be doing the initial testing internally, we'll find ways to get the application onto some test devices first. And these test devices are typically normal phones that one could buy from a store, but they're just within our company or our organization. Okay, there's another good question here from Chetan Kumar S. And the question is, we have a website that works in desktop, and now we are making mobile websites. We are not developing the application. What tools should we use for both manual and automation testing? Google has a nice little website that checks any existing desktop website and gives you some feedback on how suitable your desktop website is for a mobile device. And I can't remember the link right now. It'll come back to me in a minute, or I'll add it at the end of the talk to look at that. And it's a great little tool for checking interactively and getting very quick feedback within about a minute. In terms of the test automation, I would be using Selenium WebDriver to do the test automation. And I would be automating with a series of desktop web browsers such as Google Chrome and Mozilla Firefox and Internet Explorer, and then also running automated tests against the Android WebDriver and the iPhone WebDriver elements. For the Android and iPhone drivers, we can run these in an emulator or a simulator on a desktop computer. For iOS, this needs to be a Macintosh computer running OS X. We can't run it on any other operating system. For Android, we can choose Linux, Windows, or OS X, so the Mac operating systems, to run the emulators. And then also test on physical devices. And by testing on physical devices, we get the best possible feedback of how the website would work for the mobile devices. Now, this only tests the functionality of it. It doesn't test things like usability or whether the users can even read the content on the screen, whether it's scaled correctly, whether it provides the functionality a user wants on a mobile device. So even though you're not actually actively developing the application, you might want to carefully consider making some changes to the application so that it works more effectively for the users on mobile devices. And the next question I have is from Aditya Pratap, I think it's Singh, and the question is, for device-specific testing, how relevant are the services like Perfecto Mobile or Device Anywhere? I've worked with both of these companies a little bit in their products and services, and what I find is the testing of using these services is useful to augment our other testing, but it's not something that I would use as my primary source of testing. So I would prefer to test on devices that I can hold in my hand first, devices that we have within the building or the team that we're working on, and then possibly look at using crowdsourcing services from companies such as UTest or Mob4Hire to do some additional testing remotely. And then as part of that, I might be using services such as Perfecto Mobile or Device Anywhere to do some testing remotely on devices. The main reason I would want to do that, and I think this particularly holds true for some of you in India, is if your application is being developed for another market, say for the US market or for the European market, you probably want to test on those carriers, so on the AT&T network or the Verizon network or Orange in the UK or T-Mobile or Vodafone. And Perfecto Mobile and Device Anywhere allow you easy access to devices in the countries. Now, they only cover a few countries, so they don't cover the globe. For instance, you're unlikely to find Perfecto Mobile or Device Anywhere providing services in Russia, but you will find them in the US and in the UK and possibly some other countries. If you're looking at automated tests, it's also worth considering the services like Testdriven or the services which were provided by a company called Less Painful, which is now a company called Xamarin, where you can run your automated tests on their devices, sort of in the cloud, and this allows you to run your tests in parallel across lots of different devices that you don't have to own and don't have to maintain. So I will be doing that sort of testing as well to augment my other testing. And the next question I have is, what are the prerequisites for test automation on mobile projects? And this is from Joby Raj. Some of the prerequisites would be active support from the development team. I think it's really hard to do effective test automation where you don't have support from developers. They create the software we need to work with, and we need some way of interacting and driving the mobile applications. And until we get their support, we're always playing catch-up. And typically, you've got more developers than testers, and certainly more developers than test automators. So it's a bit like trying to run and carry 5 times the work with 5 people running in front of you. You're just not going to catch them up. So if they're willing to help you, they can provide the interfaces and the hooks to enable you to do effective test automation. The next thing to understand is what sort of things do you need to test. I'll give you an example. If you need to test just your application, then probably you can use the standard tools that come with the development environment, so the iOS SDK or the Android SDK. But more typically, the applications have some other interaction with software that's on the mobile device. For instance, to pick a photo from the gallery. So let's say we're writing a test automation for Twitter, then our application logs in using Twitter. We provide some extra services, but the user wants to change the photo. For test automation to be able to go to the gallery, it has to go outside the context of our application and interact with some other application, which happens to be one provided by iOS or by Android. And that means that the standard test automation is unlikely to work for us, and we need to make different choices to add support to that test automation. There are solutions or approaches for doing that. For Android, UI Automator and Monkey Runner are two possibilities. For iOS, it's a little bit harder to do this test automation, but it is possible to do it. The next question I've got is from Nilesh Patil, and it says, in terms of testing native mobile web or hybrid application, what would be my guidelines and tools? So dealing with hybrid applications, I would probably be picking a high-level test automation tool such as Calabash to do the test automation, because it includes good support for the embedded web browser that lives within the native application, and it's going to be the most effective way of doing test automation. Typically, the test automation that comes with the SDKs doesn't provide good support for the hybrid applications. Next question I have is from Shamila Kumar, and it's, how do you think the user agents would be useful for mobile testing? I think here we're referring to user agents, which is a little piece of information that web browser sends with every request to a website, and it's known as the user agent string. The user agent string is received by the web server, and the web server has some code that says, or can have some code that interprets the user agent string and says, this is an iPhone. This is Firefox version 17. This is Internet Explorer version 9. And then decides what results to send back to the web browser. So we can use user agents to simply fake requests to a website to pretend it's coming from a mobile device. Probably the best example is if you use Safari, and Safari is available on the Macintosh computers and also available for Microsoft Windows, then it has a developer menu, and they can very easily change the user agents to the different iOS devices, such as the iPads and the iPhones. And I recommend this because it's a very quick way of demonstrating the concepts. And what I suggest you do is you go and visit m.google.com and emulate, first of all, the desktop browser, and then you emulate an iPad and you emulate an iPhone. And what you may notice is you actually get different results when you emulate an iPhone from an iPad, and those two are both different from what you get if you use a browser emulating a desktop computer. However, faking the user agents doesn't allow you to test the behavior of the contents returned by the website. So we still need to do real on-device testing. The next question I've got is from Ravi Krishnadas, and the question is, wants to know how big a risk it is to do the majority of mobile testing on desktop versions of iOS or Android. In many cases, we do not have as many gadgets as we may ideally want. We end up doing a lot of testing on the desktop. Here, I think that we're referring to the emulators or simulators on the device, and running these, I'm going to call them emulators, running the emulators on a desktop computer. So we do certainly have a risk of doing our testing on the emulators or in the emulators. And typically we're not going to find any device-specific problems. So we won't find any differences in the implementation of Android in particular. But we also can't easily test things like changing network connectivity from 3G to Wi-Fi. We can't easily test rotation of the device. It's very hard to test the accelerometers. So imagine testing something like Angry Birds, which is a very popular mobile application, in an emulator. It's almost impossible to test the user experience. using an emulator. We really need to test on the devices. So typically what I would do is I would do most of my testing on devices, and I would do some testing on the emulators on the desktop. And of course, if I can't have a device, then I'm left with little option but to use the emulators. One of the benefits of using emulators is we can very quickly create an emulator, again particularly for Android, with capabilities we want to test for. So let's say that we wanted to test a new screen resolution combination. We can create an Android virtual device in about a minute, have it up and running with another couple of minutes, and do our testing within, say, 5 minutes of starting with a new screen resolution, rather than trying to find a physical hardware device with that screen resolution. So sometimes the emulator is actually a benefit to our testing. But in summary, I test more with physical devices. Don't necessarily get someone else to do some of the testing for you remotely, rather than relying only on testing with emulators. This is a question from Rajesh D, which is how to test mobile apps on different resolutions, and it ties into the previous answer I gave you. So my recommendation would be to, first of all, get a set of devices that include the different screen resolutions. Again, for Android, you can look at the dashboard, it's known as. So if you search your favorite search engine for Android, then a space and the word dashboard, one of the first set of results will be the Android dashboard, which is updated roughly a couple of times a month by Google, which shows the information by distribution, so a pie chart of the different resolutions of the devices that are connecting into Android to Google Play. And from there, I'd pick a device that represents a couple of those different screen resolutions, particularly the more popular ones. And I would also create Android virtual devices that include the different resolutions I want to test for. So this could include the QVGA screen, which is the smallest supported size of screen resolution on Android, up to the extra high density screens that represent things like the Nexus 4 screen resolution. There's a question here from Ankesh Sinha about how QTP, and I'm not quite sure what UFT is, I assume it's some test automation tool, fits into this agile methodology. So QTP is a product that's now owned by Hewlett-Packard, and there are companies that provide test automation that integrates with QTP. I've not worked with QTP for mobile, and I can't give you much more detail than to refer you to the HP website and look at their business partners. I do know there are business partners that integrate with QTP, but they're not tools that I've used. Next question I'm going to pick is from Sandhya Dasari, which is how to test any mobile application without requirements in Agile methodology. I quite often have to test applications without requirements or without explicit requirements. I'll give you a good example. I want to download a new application to my phone and try it. So inherently I'm testing the application to see whether it makes me happy, whether I like using it or not. And I will be testing it based on my expectations of the application. What do I think it should do for me? Do I see any problems that annoy me? And so I'll be using myself as the oracle, the test oracle, to decide whether the application seems to meet the requirements of what I would expect for it. If I'm testing someone else's application, perhaps I'm being paid to test someone else's application, I would be comparing it against similar applications. Let's say it's a mapping application. I would be probably comparing it against Google Maps, OpenStreetMaps, the Nokia mapping technologies, and see how this additional mapping application compares with them. Does it have additional features that the other ones don't have? Does it have more detail in the maps? Does it allow me to specify things like, I like cycling a lot, so can I pick a cycling route in Bangalore? If I can do that with a new application, I can't do it with, say, Google Maps, then perhaps I like the new application more and use it. So I'll be testing for those things. I'll be looking for omissions in functionality compared to the competitors. I'll be looking for how well it blends into the platform. And the next question is from Abhishek Hardy, and he says, I assume it's he, I'm a manual tester mainly into standalone and client server-based applications. I would like to move on to mobile testing. What automation tool do I want you to learn, and how should be my approach? Well, ultimately, I think it's you that wants to learn the tools, not me, so I'm not going to force any tool on you. However, what I would suggest is you look at the high-level BDD-style tools, which use the Cucumber and Gherkin languages. Gherkin is part of the Cucumber test automation framework, and I would start there first. There's a very good book from pragmatic programmers on Cucumber. It's written by the author of Cucumber, and it walks you through from a fairly introductory level through to quite sophisticated test automation. I suggest if you are able to get a copy of that book, so the Cucumber book from Pragmatic Programmers publishers, and get to the end of that, you'll learn quite a lot about test automation, and from there you'll then be able to do a little bit of work with the test automation for mobile platforms. And I seem to remember it has a chapter on using Frank, which is a test automation framework for iOS. So you actually have done some test automation for one of the mobile platforms if you complete all the exercises in all the chapters. Our next question I've got is from Saru Jain, and it says, maybe my question is not related to Agile, but I would like to know how testers can do performance testing. And again, I'm assuming this is in the context of mobile devices. So one of the ways of doing performance testing is to use a stopwatch, a simple device that's manual normally. It may be electronic, and I'm sure there are free web versions of stopwatches that allows me to time things from the user perspective. And I'd be running that timing in parallel to doing actual use of the device. And probably I would make sure I'm testing on a mix of devices, ranging from the latest high-end quad processor devices through to the relatively old, relatively cheap devices for Android running version 2.1 or 2.2 of Android, but more importantly with a much lower performance CPU, memory, and network connectivity, and compare the results of the user visible behaviors. If you have access to the source code or can work with the developers, I would also add instrumentation into the application using mobile analytics and use that to gather data on the performance of the application. This typically is a slightly lower level in the application than through the user interface, but we're able to gather data, and then by using the application we can gather performance metrics. If you want to test the servers, and quite often when we have mobile applications they're actually also integrated with some sort of back-end servers over the internet, then we can test the API using the standard performance testing tools, which are both open source and from commercial vendors such as HP. So there we're simply doing API level performance testing rather than focusing on the application. Next question is from Ramana Ranga, which is the Selenium Android driver a good test automation tool for testing Android applications? It's only relevant for testing web-based applications, so ones that run in the web browsers that are also accessible from a desktop browser. It doesn't work for testing the native applications. For testing the native applications, I would probably start, if you're a programmer, and if you're working with Selenium Android, I assume you can write code, then I would start with something like Robotium, which is an open source free test automation framework that builds on top of the Google test automation, and use that as my first approach for testing Android applications. There may be cases where that isn't the most suitable tool, for instance where we're integrating with the gallery, and for that I might use UI Automator instead. I'm just reading through some of the many questions, because I realize we're almost out of time. I want to answer a couple more before we finish. The next question that I'm picking on is from Sudha Laxman, and the question is, in an agile world where the duration is very minimum, let's say 2 weeks, how can we bring automation into place? The first thing is to get the support of the development team. As I mentioned earlier on in answer to one of the other questions, without their support it's going to be very hard to do this. Then I would look for doing a proof of concept automation, perhaps for one of the new features that's relatively easy to get started with. and do some experimentation, perhaps by working alongside one of the development team, if they're willing and able to do that, to find ways to write the initial skeletal test automation. And I would then take that couple of automated tests and try and integrate them into the continuous build process so that those tests are run regularly, because we want them to provide feedback to developers each time the code is rebuilt, rather than just running the automated test perhaps once at the end of the sprint. So we need to get ways to integrate the automated tests into the standard development process and focus on that first, and then if that's useful for the team, then you can flesh out and expand the test automation. So there's a question here from Ravi Ramanaraju, and it says, Julian, you were telling about automated tools for testing the mobile applications. Is those tools are capable of testing across multiple platforms, across multiple screen sizes? So for this, I would suggest you look at Calabash and the work of Testdriven. You'll find Testdriven online for being able to create these automated tests. With Testdriven, they have a test recorder for Android in particular that generates Robotium scripts, and they'll do the testing across multiple screen sizes if you deploy it across those different devices. I think that the basic service is free. You probably need to pay for the service, I think, on a monthly basis if you want to test across a wider range of devices. So that's something that you need to discuss with whoever's paying you to do your work in terms of doing that test automation. And they'll be using typically high-level test automation, so the BDD-style tools. Next question is from Shiva MS, and the question is, shall I know disadvantages in iOS UI automation, instrument automation tool, because I'm using iOS automation tool to do automation? Yes, it's always worth knowing about the advantages and disadvantages and limitation of any test automation tool we're doing, including the UI automation tool that comes as part of the instruments framework with iOS. What I encourage you to do is use websites such as stackoverflow.com and look at the questions that are being asked by other people about how to do test automation with the tool that you want to try and work with, and you'll get some very clear ideas of where the problem areas are, and hopefully also get some answers from people answering these questions to see how they solve these test automation problems. So that's a good way of understanding the disadvantages. And I expect you'll find your own disadvantages. In some cases, there may be problems to do with your lack of understanding or knowledge at the moment, where once you find the answers, you can then solve the problem. In other cases, it's an inherent limitation in the tool, sometimes by design, sometimes it's just a facet of the tool. So you need to find ways to disambiguate between those. And I would encourage you to learn how to write good questions on Stack Overflow. And by a good question, I mean one that's easy for someone else to answer well. So if you write a question that says, help, I can't do something, it's very hard for someone to give you specific advice apart from to write a better question. But if you're able to demonstrate and show to people that this is the problem you're facing, here's some sample code, this is what you've tried to do, and you explain what you would like to happen and what happens instead, someone else can then pick up your sample code, run it on their local machine, modify it, and give you the answer back with relatively little effort on their part. And if you remember that anyone who's providing these answers is typically a volunteer and doing it in their own time, then it's really important to make it as easy as practical for them to help you. Otherwise, to be honest, you're wasting your time. I'm going to pick a question from the end of the list here. This is from Rajesh D. And the question is, what's the major difference between mobile apps and hybrid apps? So a mobile app is a general term, at least for me it's a general term, and can describe any type of application. I have a couple of different categories of application which are more specific. I have web applications, I have hybrid applications, and I have native applications. A hybrid application combines some native code, which is specific to the mobile platforms such as iOS or Android, and includes a web browser as well. So the web browser is typically embedded into the application. The user may not even realize that there's a web browser being used. To them, it just looks like part of the application. It's very commonly used in applications to deal with the logon process. So for instance, let's say you want to log on to eBay using the eBay application. It might use a web view, which is the web component, to do the logon. And then once the logon's completed successfully, it then returns to the native application. So a hybrid application includes the native code and the web code into a single application. A native application is written using the development tools for that platform, so Objective-C or Java for Android, and it's focusing on purely that platform. A question from Zakia Nazreen, which is, can I use Visual Studio for mobile automation? Yes, you can and you should if you're doing Windows Phone 7, Windows Phone 8 mobile automation. I don't think it's suitable for anything else. And I would encourage you to use Eclipse, which is the standard tool used for Android, or use Xcode, which is a standard tool used for iOS development. So use the same IDE as the developers are using to write the application, to write the test automation. I'm just scrolling through the rest of the questions. Next question I've got is from R. Siva, which is it necessary to write a test plan in Agile testing in a mobile environment? Yes, I would write a brief test plan that's focusing on the sprints that we're working in. And if you look at the website I mentioned earlier, which is do.testme.wordpress.com, how I test in a sprint article, that's got a great overview of how long he would spend doing the planning side of it. So I encourage you to read that article. A question from Meenu Jain, which is, what are the major points that we should take care when testing an application on a keypad phone and a touch phone? There are several different ways I can interpret keypad phone and touch phone. I'm going to interpret them as smartphones, so iPhones, Android devices. For iPhones, they're only available as touch phones, so touch screens. So inherently, we're dealing with what's known as a virtual keyboard or a soft keyboard for our testing, where the keyboard appears as part of the screen and it overlays the existing content on the screen. So I'll be looking for things like, is the remaining part of the application that's visible sensible? Does it provide the right information, the right context to enable me to type in the values correctly? To give you an example, if I'm being asked to type in a password field with an Android device in portrait mode, I'll typically see part of the screen. If I rotate it into landscape mode, I just get a text area to write in, so I might have forgotten the context of what I'm typing in now. So I need to know what the context is to remember, I'm typing my password in here for this application. And typically, I'd expect the users to be working in portrait mode to put that information in and make sure I can see that I'm entering the value into the password field at that time. Some Android devices include a physical keyboard, and that would mean that I can type in on the keyboard and the screen shouldn't have the soft keyboard visible at this point. So it's in some ways easy to test and make sure that the virtual keyboard doesn't appear or get in the way. The next question is from Manpreet Kaur, and the question is, what's the difference between usage of Selenium WebDriver for desktop websites and for mobile websites? There are a number of differences. The test automation for desktop browsers is where we're actually using very good integration with the actual web browser that we're using for testing, so Internet Explorer or Firefox or Google Chrome, Safari, etc. And we're actually using the real browser that runs on the device. When we're doing a test automation for the mobile web browsers on iOS and Android, what's actually being tested is a WebView component. The WebView component was used in the original browsers on these devices, on Android and iOS, and so it was effectively the same rendering engine, with a different user interface. It didn't have the, say, bookmarks, type in the URL fields, for instance, but the behavior was very similar. Now that we've got a greater choice of web browsers for the mobile devices, including Google Chrome and Firefox and Opera and a bunch of other mobile browsers, then when we're testing with Selenium WebDriver, it's only using the inbuilt WebView component. It's not testing with all these different web browsers. So we get different behaviors, and that would mean I'd also want to do some interactive testing using these different web browsers on devices. The Google team have announced the Chrome driver for Android for Selenium WebDriver, which will be available at some point in the future. I don't know the details, and I don't know if the forecast dates are going to be accurate yet, but if we pay attention to the upcoming Chrome driver, we should also be using that once it's available for Selenium WebDriver tests. Right, I've gone through the questions, and I think what I'm going to suggest is that I'm going to end the session now, because we spent just over an hour in total, and I'm going to thank you very much for your many, many questions. I apologize particularly to people where I've not been able to answer any of your questions. It would take me the rest of the day to even answer them briefly, so I apologize, there's only one of me. However, thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to the moderator now and let them take care of wrapping up the session.
So much for the session, Julia. You did a great job answering a lot of questions that came from our attendees today. I'm really thankful to you for conducting this session. I would also like to thank all our participants for their support in making this webinar a success and sending in so many questions to make the session interesting. I would like to inform you all that the recording of this session would be available on tegig.com by today evening. Thank you all. Have a great day.